Philanthropy and development. And so that's really why I'm here. Now, I rather foolishly mentioned for when I was in Britain to the director of CEPA that I've been working on social protection for the Asian Development Bank. And that because of this, I'd come across this bizarre thing called inclusive growth, which I found very confusing. And she talked to me, bullied me, persuaded me to talk about it briefly here, and that's what I'm going to do today. But as I say, I'm an anthropologist, I'm not an economist, and I'm looking at this very much from the outside. I'm looking for it ultimately in the context of social protection, which is something slightly different. Also, I am an economist, a consultant. And you will know that how do you define a consultant? Well, it's someone who borrows your watch to tell you the time. I don't have a watch, so when I look at my phone, I'm not looking for new jobs. I'm looking to see what time I've used up, because I've been told to talk for 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do then is look at inclusive growth as developed by the World Bank and others, and suggest that it offers nothing new. And that it's primarily, I can't even see what I'm saying, it's primarily a rather seductive term. It sounds very nice, but basically it's more of the same. And there is no real shift from what came before, Washington Consensus, post-Washington Consensus, and this new thing called inclusive growth, which has become central to World Bank thinking about development, and I'm afraid central to Asian Development Bank thinking about development. I'm never very good with these things. Oh yes. Now if you look at Vision 2020, which is the Asian Development Bank's strategy for the years from 2008 to 2020, the three major components of Strategy 2020 that's good. The three things: environmentally sustainable growth, regional integration, and inclusive growth. But it's not very clear to me what inclusive growth is. And looking at 2020, the strategy 2020, this is how it's defined. Now you can't see it good. Inclusive growth, two mutually reinforcing strategic foci. First, high sustainable growth will create and expand economic opportunities. I want to stress the word opportunities there. Second, broader access to these opportunities will ensure that members of society can participate in and benefit from growth. So again, you've got opportunities, you've got access, and that's what's key to it. It must improve the poor's access to markets and basic productive assets by putting in place sound policies and institutions. Again, this stress on access to markets, basic productive assets. Investments will provide the opportunities for all, not for all, to improve their standards of living, thereby contributing to economic growth, poverty reduction, and the mitigation of extreme inequalities. Note it says mitigation. It doesn't say removal. It doesn't say getting rid of them. It says mitigation. Now, this is what ADB say in 2020. It's all a bit vague. And this man called Klassen, who is a consultant employed by ADB, has been through all the use that ADB has made of this concept, or the definitions they've used, and has come up with three rather different definitions of what inclusive growth might mean in the ADB context, in ADB publications. First of all is declining inequality, which might be one idea of inclusive growth. Secondly, other publications talk about pro-poor investments in social opportunities. And the third set of documents talk about equal opportunities and equal access. So in other words, it's not at all clear to me in a way, and it wasn't clear to Klassen either, what ADB means by inclusive growth. Because these are rather different things. Declining inequality is one thing. Pro-poor investments in social opportunities is another. Equal opportunities, equal access is a third. Is it about outcomes, which would be decreased inequality, or is it about process, which is about increased opportunities. And so this led me to try and trace back this idea of inclusive growth and try and work out where it had come from. And as far as I can make out, and I'm probably wrong, the first mentions of inclusive growth are in the Indian 11th five-year plan, which was published, I think, in 2006. And here it says that the five-year plan is not just about faster growth, but also inclusive growth. And what is inclusive growth? Inclusive growth yields broad-based benefits and ensures equality of opportunity for all. Very nice, but very, very vague. And from there, I turned to the World Bank, because in the end, even if one may disagree with the World Bank's political stance, intellectual stance, and so on, they are usually intellectually very rigorous, and there's some very, very, very fine thinkers at work there, much, very impressive. And if there was going to be any insights into what inclusive growth might mean, I thought I might find it here. And as far as I can make out, there were three key documents. There was this World Development Report in 2006 called Equity in Development. There was a 2008 Growth Report, Strategies for Sustained Growth and Inclusive Development. And then a rather peculiar note published in 2009, available on the web, called What is Inclusive Growth? Now, the 2006 World Development Report is a fascinating document. It's the World Bank's attempt to introduce the concept of equity into the development debate. And it's got lots and lots of philosophy in it, most of it are rather dubious, and it's got some extremely, I would call pretentious sociology. And that's a sociology which I think is the weakest bit. Now, by equity, we say, we mean that individuals should have equal opportunities to pursue a life of their choosing and be spared from extreme deprivation in outcomes. Now, note the stress here again is on opportunities. It's a lack of equal opportunities which is important. When you read it, you discover that people have lack opportunities because of two reasons. First of all, because of market failures, and secondly, because systems of power and wealth necessarily lead people to favour their own. So what you've got to do to create equity of opportunity is to make the market more extensive, to bring people into the market who are excluded from the market, to make the market work, get rid of market failures, and by implication, you've got to get rid of those systems of power and wealth which lead to people favouring their own and which lead to the lack of they use the term, a level playing field. Now, interestingly, they say there's nothing wrong with unequal outcomes. That doesn't matter, they say, as long as they don't affect opportunities. Outcomes, rich, poor, health, sickness, education, non-education, in an odd way, all these outcomes, differential outcomes, do not matter. It's opportunities that are important. And indeed, as long as opportunities are equal, you can have massive disparities, and that's fine, as far as they're concerned. And this is taken up in the Growth Report. Now, the Growth Report isn't just the World Bank at work here, there's also lots of other agencies, DFID for one, being involved. And it takes much the same line, this distinction between opportunities and outcomes. But it takes it a bit further, because here we discover that equity of opportunity isn't just a matter of morality or ethics, which is fine, but it's much more important, it's a practical issue. Inequality of opportunity, they say, can be toxic. Such injustices undermine social peace and spark political unrest. They will ultimately derail the economy's growth strategy. In other words, what's all important is the growth strategy, not the people. What's important here with equity of opportunity isn't the moral good in itself, but if you don't have this moral equity of opportunity, then there is going to be political chaos. So what you have to do to maintain this differences of outcome, which are perfectly okay, is to have equal opportunities, which will prevent people rising on the street, and so on. Now, yes, they say there is a worry about outcomes, that's true. Not as bad as the inequalities of opportunities. We have to do something about them. But on the whole, people are very understanding. They understand that markets do not produce equal outcomes. This is a direct quote from the bank, from this document. They will tolerate this inequality, provided that governments take steps to contain it. No, to contain it, not to do away with it, just to contain it, to make it bearable. And this is where my work on social protection comes in, because social protection is effectively a means of keeping the poor happy enough so they don't rebel. So in other words, in this reading of what inclusive growth is, it's basically about managing social unrest. It's not about the poor, it's not about equity, it's about preventing people being unhappy and starting challenging differentials of wealth and poverty. Now, the final document from the bank, which I want to look at very briefly, is a note called What is Inclusive Growth? And this is interesting because this isn't a nice glossy, it's a sort of rather scrappy note. It was quite clear that by 2009, people within the bank and elsewhere were a bit confused as to what inclusive growth meant. Naive people like me, for instance, would tend to think that the term indicated that this meant that poor people would be getting richer, that gaps between rich and poor would be getting less, and so on. But this document is a very firm statement that it's nothing to do with that at all. Inclusive growth is defined in terms of the pace of growth and the creation of what it calls productive employment. Here it links up with the whole idea that the problem with people who are only partially employed or unemployed is not that these people therefore don't have much money or live in poverty, but this is a wasted resource. And this human resource should be mobilized and used. Inclusive growth, therefore, means using these people, this wasted resource, this unused human capital. What's more, what's important, they say, and very clearly, is it's not relative, but absolute poverty. Inclusive, under a situation of successful inclusive growth, according to this document, the gap between rich and poor can become wider. It does not get less. So the gap between the very rich and the poor can widen and widen. But through creating productive employment, which isn't ever clearly defined, but it's there, productive employment, absolute levels of poverty are reduced. So for growth to be inclusive, productivity must be improved and new employment opportunities created. Again, we're back to this idea of a level playing field, and they actually use the term level playing field, which I find quite bizarre, really. And they say almost nothing about poverty, and it says even less about morality. So inclusive growth, as far as I can make out, is nothing about dealing with poverty, nothing about dealing with social inequality. And so I don't think there's anything new in the end in this idea of inclusive growth. It's basically the Washington Consensus, the post-Washington Consensus rephrased. The key to growth is through the expansion of the market economy, that the problem for the poor is that they have been excluded from the market, so those cases where markets have led to people being included in the market economy, and then the market economy having a crisis, and then poverty being created, are just ignored. Poverty will be eliminated through the spread of productive employment. And in the end, it seems to me this whole idea is driven by a fear of political instability, the toxic nature of unequal opportunities, rather than any moral imperative. And the idea that you can somehow do away with unequal opportunities, what's surprising in the way it's formulated by the World Bank and also by the ADB in some of its presentations, is a lack of any political or sociological analysis. There's a naive dreaming that somehow investments in education or infrastructure, better regulatory systems, better health systems, will somehow create a level playing field, will somehow do away with inequality of opportunities, will somehow detoxify this. And this is somewhat surprising, this stress on inclusive growth, given that in the latest Asian Development Outlook, which ADB has produced, they do recognise the political dangers of increasing inequality, per se, inequality of outcomes. But in the end, all they can talk about is the inequality of opportunities. And this final, I don't know if you can see it very well, this final diagram table, which I've stolen from a guy at SOAS, tries to compare the Washington Consensus, the post-Washington Consensus, and this supposed new idea of inclusive growth. And if you look down the columns, you'll see that there is very, very little difference between the three. We go through it if you like. So what I'm saying is, as far as I can make out, and I worried about inclusive growth because I was having to do this literature review on social protection. Once I'd worked all my way through, I came to the conclusion that there was nothing new about it, and we were back to where we were at the beginning. It also impinges on what I'm trying to understand social protection, because social protection turned out to be not about protecting the weak, the marginal, the excluded. Social protection turns out to be about how to make use of these wasted resources, these wasted human resources, and produce greater economic growth, and by implication, greater social differentiation, and by implication, greater wealth for the rich, and a widening gap between rich and poor. Well, if you hang for a sheep or a goat, I'd go for the sheep.
Would anyone like to ask a clarification or two, or should we let Professor Sanderatne also have his say and then open it up? I think we'll let you have your say.
Okay.
Okay. And then we'll open it up to the...
Well, as we were listening to the most fascinating presentation, my thoughts went to the very first open forum we had in CEPA many years ago. I believe it was about 15 years ago, when the theme we discussed that day was why poverty persists. Now, it appears that what we are discussing today as inclusive growth is not very much different to the more old-fashioned idea of why poverty persists. And of course, there has been a recent interest in this concept, in this issue, because we have had the experiences of a number of developing countries having impressive rates of economic growth, and then still the persistence of poverty in those countries. And of course, the most significant examples or instances are the cases of China and India. In both these large countries, you have had very high rates of growth. There has been very major strides made in both of them. in the case of China to the extent that during this decade it is expected to be the world's largest economy, superseding that of the United States. And still, despite that, we have a situation where China has about 200 million people in dire poverty. And there's a similar situation in India. But let's get it clear that in both countries, poverty has decreased. Economic growth has led to a reduction in poverty. But that reduction in poverty has not been adequate to find some consistency between the economic growth of those economies and the resultant situation of large segments of people being in poverty. Now, there is also the situation where it was somewhat different in the case of East Asia, where with growth there was a much more egalitarian economic outcome. And therefore one sort of the natural question that arises is, why this sort of difference? And I might also say that Western countries, developed countries, are also facing a situation where with growth, very significant segments of the population are not having access to adequate economic opportunities and incomes. Now this poses a huge problem, question of why do we have this situation of high economic growth still leading to large proportions of populations in these countries being poor. Now I'll just attempt to give a few reasons that strike me. One is that the modern strategies of economic growth leave out opportunities for a large segment of people. The more sophisticated kind of economic strategies means that those who do not have the wherewithal by which they could participate in the economic growth process is limited. That is one of the reasons. The second is that the old idea of asset and income distribution has become rather out of fashion. The whole focus has been on growth. What is the rate of economic growth? What is the increase in per capita income? And so forth. But not whether the strategies adopted and the policies that go with it are ones which will improve income distribution. And to cite a few examples, in Britain, for instance, in the 1960s, people like Nicholas Caldo, his whole taxation system that he proposed was one of redistribution of wealth and thereby the reduction of poverty and inequity. Now, hardly anyone talks of that kind of economic strategy today. Another example is that in the 1960s and 70s, land reform was a very important issue. And again, no one talks about redistribution of land today. So the issues of redistribution of assets, which have a very important bearing on income, is neglected. And if you don't have, if the distribution of assets is skewed, then the result is, of course, that you get a skewed income distribution as well. Now, East Asia that I referred to had programs of very substantial asset distribution. And East Asia is also an instance where policies of land reform were successful. Now, countries like India had programs of land reform, but they were hardly effectively implemented. So the asset situation remained more or less the same in South Asia and many other countries, but in East Asia there was a very effective land reform program. A very good example is, of course, Taiwan, where the land reform took the land away from the landed aristocracy, so to speak, but gave them compensation, which was in the form of debentures in industrial ventures, while the others received the land, the farmers received land. And after all, particularly that early stage of development, land is the determining factor in income. Of course, it is not so now. These countries that have diversified, it is not agriculture that is really the moving lever. The third aspect I want to deal with is, and this is what is referred to as opportunities. And I think the biggest levers to improve incomes and reduce poverty are measures to impart education and good health to the population. And that I consider an intergenerational lever in the distribution of incomes. Now, we have seen some of that happening in Sri Lanka due to past strategies of in our free education and free health programs. And we have seen people from very modest backgrounds reach the very, very top. And also today, because of our free education system, you get a number of people whom I come across, whose parents are of very modest incomes. They are, for instance, non-English speaking, their education has been very limited, but their children are in medical college, their children are doing degrees at the universities, and so there's a real transformation occurring. But again, and here I'm referring particularly to Sri Lanka, we have this situation which has got a lot of prominence these days of our expenditure on education coming down. In the 60s, we had about 3.5% of GDP on education. Today it's 1.7. So that is another aspect. And why that has happened is also because in Sri Lanka and a lot of the other countries, there has been a distortion in the priorities of public expenditure. And defense expenditure has become a very big component. And if you spend money, large amounts of money on defense, as it is the case whether it is India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka, then you do not have money to spend on these very important areas of social welfare which have a significant bearing on the outcomes of income distribution. I think I'll leave it at that, some thoughts, and I think there are so many more issues that one can really raise on this issue, but I'll just say one final word, that this is an area where there is a lot of rhetoric and very little action. Thank you.